Welcome to This Must Be the Place. I'm your host, Alo Galinsky. Each week, I'll uncover what's happening in Sonoma County, diving into the hidden gems and quirky corners. I'll be interviewing some of our local legends, as well as people you didn't know you need to know, all through the eyes of a craft beer enthusiast living in wine country. Join me as we explore one sip, one story, and one adventure at a time, and together we'll find out why this must be the place. Today, we're joined by the best-selling author Paula McLain, whose books include The Paris Wife, Circling the Sun, and Love and Ruin, novels that illuminate the inner lives of women that history has left in the margins. In her powerful new novel, Skylark, McLain returns to Paris, where a woman's quest for artistic freedom reveals a story of courage and resistance that transcends time. To mark the release, Paula will be reading from Skylark and taking part in a Morning in Paris-themed conversation at Little Saint in Healdsburg on Saturday, February 7th at 10 a.m., in collaboration with Francophile and photographer Rebecca Plotnick. A morning full of coffees, pastries, and Parisian magic, this event offers local readers a rare opportunity to hear directly from one of contemporary fiction's most compelling voices. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, Alo. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation in Healdsburg. A lot of my readers have been reaching out, fangirling Rebecca Plotnick, going, "Oh my God, I've been obsessed with her for years. I can't believe you get to meet her." So I'm pretty psyched.
Well, it sounds like it'll be a great collaboration coming up. And I know our listeners out there, if you're not familiar with this event, make sure to go check it out online and make sure you know who's going to be there with this wonderful author and this wonderful photographer. To start off our conversation here, Paula, would you like to start off with a short reading from Skylark, your new book?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. So just to set this up a little bit, the character we're learning about is Alouette. She's a young woman in 1664 in Paris. Her father is a master die maker, and she longs herself to make color. And the other thing you need to know is that the River Bièvre that she's talking about is the center of die making culture in Paris and in France and in much of Europe, because the components of its water, but also the die makers and all the other working trades dump their poisons into the river. And so she's sort of in a love-hate relationship with the Bièvre. So this is just two paragraphs from Alouette's point of view. The Bièvre isn't anything like the Seine. It's not a river for poets or queens. It's a workers' river, a whore's river. But it's also a river of power. Beneath its poisoned surface lies an alchemy of minerals, the last remnants of the deep past when all of France lay beneath a warm, shallow sea. As much as she hates the filth of the Bièvre, Alouette can also see a flicker of possibility. While the guild masters hoard their knowledge behind high walls, the river offers its secrets freely to anyone patient enough to listen, anyone stubborn enough to resist the rules that bind women like her to numbing lives of labor and service to others. She's collected those secrets one by one, kept them close like hidden treasures no one can take from her, knowing that no matter what others see, the river can still work surprising magic, magic powerful enough, perhaps, to change her life.
Well, thank you so much. That's beautiful. Yeah. And it makes me intrigued. I love how you personify the river there and give the river these qualities that you might only attribute to a human being, but you're giving it to this body of water.
Yeah, thank you. And, Paris is also a major character in the novel in two time periods. Yeah, this river was a surprise to me. It came out of my research that the River Bièvre, existed for a long time. As I said, it was the center of die making culture and all of the working trades. And that it was culverted in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because it was so squalid and putrid and causing disease for the city. So it's invisible now. It's still there, just under the surface.
Deep under the surface. Now, a little bit under the surface about the novel. I know you alluded to it a bit when we started talking, but for listeners who might be new to your work, can you tell us a little bit more about what Skylark is about?
Absolutely. So that was Alouette. As I said, she's the daughter of a die maker in Saint-Marcel, Paris, and he has worked for his entire career to perfect the color red. And Alouette herself wants to make color more than anything, but it's impossible in her world for two reasons: because of the guild that I alluded to. All of the crafts and arts were dictated by the guild, and women could not be craftsmen. Women could not make art. They had no creative freedom whatsoever. And also because of her class. So at that time in Europe and for many hundreds of years. And this is just a freaky thing about history. It just sort of like surprises me over and over again. I'll be deep into some rabbit hole of my research and learn something. And I learned that there were these things, laws in place called sumptuary restrictions throughout much of Europe, which meant that members of the clergy, aristocracy, and nobility could wear color, but no one of the lower classes or any embellishment or finery of any kind. And so here's this young woman who I created to be someone who was given a colorless life on multiple planes. And for her, leaning into color and beauty and all the things she wants for herself is a way to hold on to her sense of self and her dignity and her soul, and what she will and will not do to pursue creative freedom kind of defines her story. So that's Alouette. And then in the 1940s, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, we meet a young medical resident, Christoph Larsen, who two things are important about him. One, he becomes obsessed with the tunnels that run beneath the streets of Paris. We'll talk about that more, I'm sure. And also he befriends a Jewish family in his apartment building, and his relationship with those people, and particularly for the young daughter, Sasha, of that family, will define the rest of his life.
So it sounds like a lot of this was rooted in your personal knowledge of Paris, but also history. Was there any one idea that first sparked Skylark coming out of your creativity? And what brought you back to Paris as a setting?
Yeah. Well, it was kind of an accident, but a very happy accident, because of course I love Paris, and Paris changed my life. I mean, Paris changed my career with my novel, The Paris Wife, which came out in 2011. But this time I was walking my dog one day. I listen to podcasts a lot, and I was listening to On Being with Krista Tippett, and she was interviewing the Robert McFarlane, the writer, and his book Underland. And he was talking about, well, if you don't know this book, it's sort of like a history of underground spaces all over the world, including ochre mines and diamond mines and the quietest place on earth, which is several hundred meters below the earth, and salt mine, just all this stuff. And then he started telling a story of an adventure he took where he crossed from one side of Paris from north to south, a journey that took 3 days because he did it entirely underground. Never broke the surface of the earth the entire time. And
That's
that was
cool.
me. Like, I was just like mind blown. I'd been to the catacombs with my kids. It's this very cool thing. I'm sure you know about it, where 6 million or so dead were exhumed and reinterred in the quarry voids beneath Paris. But I didn't know how extensive those were. I didn't know that Paris has been undermined for limestone and gypsum since the 6th century, and that there are almost 300 square miles of tunnels, like this whole labyrinth, a sister city, if you will, beneath the streets of Paris. So I just became completely obsessed. Like from that day, this is what happens when I get like hijacked by an idea and I never know it's coming. And I love the creative process and whatever, inspiration is. But I went home and started looking for stories that touch that space, stories that might, because I just was thinking like, wow, like the underground of Paris has its own history of Paris. And maybe they're parallel and maybe they're not, right? And the first story I found is what inspired the World War II story, Christoph Larsen's story. It's a really good one. It's weird. I found it the first day. I just had no idea that any of this had occurred, but there were two young medical residents at Paris's oldest hospital. It's called, psychiatric hospital. It's called St. Anne's. And it's been around since the 1300s. So it's this very old space, and it's in the 14th arrondissement, which is a very heavily undermined area. And they were just exploring the corridors one day, sort of in their off hours, and they found a wrought iron gate that happened to be open. There was a padlock which happened to be open, and they were just like the swashbuckling adventurous sort, and they pushed open the door and soon found that they had discovered a hidden entrance to the tunnels. And they started treating this space like their private Disneyland, and they began mapping it just so they wouldn't get lost, and they would have this record, and it was theirs. Like they never ran into anyone down there for several years until one day. And in the meantime, France had been taken, and Paris had become occupied by the Nazis. And anyway, they discovered a Nazi bunker underground, and it terrified them. And this is, as I say, a true story. These two young doctors sped up their mapping. They found a way to turn their maps over to the French resistance. And that is how the liberation of Paris was plotted from underground, because of these two doctors that just happened to push open a gate one day. And then later they won the French Medal of Honor. And much later, one of those two doctors became the first neuroscientist to map the brain.
Those are some really fascinating people that you've stumbled upon.
Yeah, I love history. I flippin' love history.
I can tell.
Mhm.
Speaking of history, you do have this setting of place with the catacombs in Paris, but you also set this book in two different time periods. Skylark connects a dyer's daughter in 1664 and a medical student in 1939. Was there something that demanded these two eras to be told together in your mind, or just with the history connection, as you mentioned a little bit?
Yeah. So that second storyline, the 1940s one, was entirely finding that story that day. But I didn't, I've spent the last 15 years kind of trafficking in history and writing a lot about real people and illuminating their, little known lives, or like Case of the Paris Wife, which is about, Ernest Hemingway's first wife, etc. But this time, I just had this sense that I wanted to take a bigger bite of history. I wanted to paint on a bigger canvas. And that one story, as fascinating as it was, certainly I could have stayed in that lane. I wanted to know what other stories touched that space. And so that's what led me back to 1664, because I was looking for other underground stories. So I found this river, the Bièvre, which, in Christoph's time is underground.
Sure.
So I wanted sort of that above and below dichotomy, that tension. And also I just, that the history of dye making, like all of that was just such an accident to learn that this area of Paris, which at that moment was outside of the city walls, the village of Saint-Marcel is what is now the 13th arrondissement. And like I said, it was the working class's working class, right? It was like the most squalid area. And there was a reason for that, because at that time, King Louis, and I always forget which number he was. I'm pretty sure he was the 16th, but it all gets to be a blur at some point.
I'm not the one to ask here.
Yes. But the Sun King, anyway, he wanted Paris to be a shining city, like to rival Rome. And in order to do that, he wanted every, speck of poverty and illness and disease and all the lepers and the prostitutes and everyone to be kind of swept to the side so that nobody had to see them. And so the working class's working class was beyond the city walls. And all of these people, like Alouette's father, like the couriers, working so that other people could appreciate beauty. And if you think about it, all of Paris that we know of as Paris, the skyline, the monuments and the cathedrals and all of that are created from this limestone, which has been taken from the earth by people who never got to appreciate the beauty that they helped create. And that kind of tension was also something that I wanted to to seed in the book. And also the way, you ask, what are these stories? Why did they demand to be told together? What I wanted to show is that history repeats itself. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it again, by the way, in this exact moment, that there are forces that are encouraging rage, that they're exercising control, coercion, erasure, annihilation of others. And in both of these storylines, the untouchables, those who should not be seen, or those who are considered to be less than, like the Jews in the 1940 story, or like the impoverished and the mad in Alouette's story, that there are always these forces, and history does repeat itself and requires a kind of the same moral courage, no matter what century you're in, to push back and find the light.
Well, it sounds really powerful. I mean, it just sounds like you've created voices for these two characters. And speaking of that, what was your biggest challenge or a biggest challenge in balancing those two voices? You have a 17th century voice, a 20th century voice. How do you craft that as a writer?
Messily, or at least I do, because that's the kind of person I am. I got my start as a poet. I actually went to graduate school to write poetry, and I am not a rational person. Very much intuitive as a writer, and I just kind of lean in. I just had this idea that these stories belong together, but I wrote them separately at the same time. I wrote them side by side, and that was the biggest challenge of the book, essentially holding these two narrative threads and working on them deeply and doing all the research required for each one. And they were speaking to each other the whole time. I would come to a moment in Alouette's story that would suggest a moment in Christophe's story, or it would make me need to lean in a little deeper to some other aspect of that story. And so I knew all along that they went together, but it wasn't until I got to the end of each story that I braided them together. I actually had this notion to go to New York and do it with my editor so that physically we had copies of the book. My agent was there too, and we'd each read it like a million times. I had read it. I mean, it was in my bloodstream at that point, but they had each read it at least 20 times. And we just sat there with physical copies and post-it notes and wove it together like a stack of cards, this like physical act of collaboration. I've never done anything like that, and I'll never forget it. It was totally magical. It was amazing.
I bet. It sounds like a
Yeah.
great experience.
Yeah.
Now, historical records, when they focus on what women did rather than what they felt, how do you responsibly imagine those interior lives?
The empathetic imagination. I mean, that's what we do as writers and artists. And the first time it really occurred to me deeply was when I was working on The Paris Wife. So I became obsessed with Ernest Hemingway's first wife. And I started researching his life and her life. I found a cache of their love letters in a library in Boston and went there to read. And, even though I had access to all of this wealth of materials, I still had to project myself imaginatively into, they meet at a party in Chicago in 1920. No one is there who can tell me what they talked about. It's not on paper, it's not anywhere. I don't know what they thought about, I don't know how they made love or, what they did when they fought. Like all of that has to be imagined. And it's the most interesting part of my job, really, is to take these. I think of it as like the scalp history is the scaffolding, like the triceratops at the Natural History Museum, the bones, we see the shape of it, but my job is to put everything else in there, the skin and the bones and the flesh and the blood and the soul of
Right.
this creature.
And when the historical record goes quiet, do you feel freer or more responsible as a novelist?
Both. Both. Like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like the tarot card of the fool, right? Where he's got his little
Sure.
dog and the stick and he's going on this adventure, and who knows if, he's just beginning, right? And he's sailing over the edge of a cliff, but his vision is looking out, so he doesn't know that he's doing it. And that does describe the creative process a lot, right? I'm like, I've got my eye on the prize. I'm like sailing off the edge of a cliff. And sometimes when I realize that there's nothing beneath me, that is the most exciting part, that I have to sort of meet that space imaginatively, which we do all in all kinds of ways. We certainly do it as readers, don't we? We
Absolutely.
imagine everything we're not told. We do that 100 times a second, a million times a second.
And it sounds like you enjoy challenging yourself in that regard too.
Yeah, I mean, anything good that's ever happened to me in my creative life has happened because I did something new, or I broke the rules for myself, or I tried something I'd never tried before. I'm an underdog. I sort of like being over my head.
I get that. And sometimes it's fun to see, what you're capable of.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are writers who enjoy being branded and having a pigeonhole. Not to disparage them, I think that's awesome, but I've just never wanted that for myself. Like the idea is what dictates the genre. I've written in suspense, I've written memoir, I've written a contemporary novel. I've written, several historical novels, but they're quite different. So yeah, I want to continue to grow as an artist.
And speaking of all your novels as a whole, is there one detail you discovered during research for Skylark or one of your other novels that completely changed the direction of where you may have been headed at one point?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say with Skylark, because it's the sort of the most recent canvas, I never wanted to write a World War II novel. Like never, ever, ever. I just thought, what's fresh about that? Everyone's written about it. And I didn't think there was anything new. And then I found this story about these two doctors, and I sort of loved that, like not having any idea the way that these tunnels sort of factored in the shape of the war. But then I also found another detail, and it created another voice in Christoph's story that I didn't expect to be writing from. This young girl named Sasha that I mentioned earlier, who lives in Christoph's apartment building, and her family is persecuted like many of the Jews in Paris at the time. But what I didn't know until I started reading autobiographical accounts of people who had survived that time in Paris is that, do you know the novel Sarah's Key?
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, well, and it's a film too, and it dramatizes a period in Paris's history in the 1940s, 1942. In July, almost 30,000 Jews were arrested and taken to a bicycle arena called the Veldiv. There were raids that took place over 3 days, and it's a shameful, shocking, awful part of Paris's history, namely because it wasn't the Nazis who rounded up these Jews and arrested them. It was the French police who were in collusion with the Nazis in order to protect their own skin. Again, it sounds shocking, except today there's a lot that sounds a lot like this. But what I didn't know until I started to read these narrative accounts is that for those days, in a bureaucratic loophole, teenagers between the ages of 14 and 18 were released, Jewish teenagers if they were French citizens. So their parents had been arrested, and then they were turned back out on the streets.
Wow.
Not knowing, and in many cases, they would never see their families again, but they also had no home to go back to because their apartments had already been conscripted and the concierge had already turned over the key to the police and to the Nazis. And that to me was absolutely shocking that has happened. I never heard anything like that. And once I knew I needed to tell that story, I couldn't have Christoph tell that story. He's like a 30-year-old, Dutch doctor. I needed to get closer to it. And so I let Sasha have a voice in the piece, and she became one of my favorite characters. I mean, she's amazing.
And for our listeners out there, I guess you'll just have to read to find out just about Sasha. Now, speaking kind of Sasha and your other characters, women are at the emotional center of your novels. Was that a conscious choice early on, or something that just emerged naturally to you?
Yeah, it just emerged naturally. I think it happened when I wrote The Paris Wife and realized that it was kind of a feminist act, that I had accidentally taken this figure from history who had been overshadowed and eclipsed by her husband. History didn't know her at all. And to illuminate her life felt really powerful. And so, yeah, an accident, and it became very quickly kind of my favorite part of my job, to not just tell an entertaining story, but to illuminate a life that deserves to be known.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like that. And I like that I can do this with history at large.
And many of these women you write about lived close to power or a greatness, but they remained in the shadows. And was there something in particular that drew you to examine those lives in specific?
Yeah, I think when I said earlier, like I'm an underdog, like I'm a scrapper, if you don't know anything about my background, I actually grew up in foster care in California. I grew up in Fresno. And from the time I was 4 until I was 18 and aged out of the system, my 2 sisters and I bounced through a series of homes. And I feel like there's something about taking a life that could have been extinguished very easily. And yeah, I'm not writing my own story, but yes, I am drawn to the voiceless to the powerless to the disenfranchised. And I like to find ways that those women then do find a quiet power or some way to overturn what's been given to them to reach for something higher. All of my stories in the end are about resilience.
Well, let's focus in on three particular women from your novels. Hadley Richardson, Beryl Markham, and Martha Gellhorn. In researching and writing about all three of them, what did you learn about the different ways these women achieved agency?
Well, that's a fun question. Thank you. I'll just go in order. I'll try to be quick, but as you have already surmised, I don't walk in a direct line, but we'll see. So what's cool about Hadley and agency, a lot of people who read The Paris Wife want to shake her because her husband is treating her ill and or cheating on her or whatever. And the thing about Hadley is she has quiet dignity and power and a solidity or a stability that is very, very surprising. Mm-hmm. So she actually, it's sort of an anti-feminist story, but she is the only reason that he was able to create himself. What we know and his genius and his entire career could not have happened if he had not married her. And I love that. With Beryl Markham, she was if you don't know her story, she was a racehorse trainer and an aviator. She grew up in colonial Kenya. And she, like me, was abandoned by her mother when she was 4 years old. And her mother came back later in her life, which my mother did too. And what's cool about Beryl is it is that very abandonment that forces her or directs her out into the kind of the wild. She isn't raised as a proper young lady, which she would have been if her mother had been there. She's a warrior, and that sets the course of her life. She was the boldest, one of the most iconoclastic women who ever lived. And we never know what's shaping our story. And that's interesting to me. And Martha Gellhorn, wow. So I never knew I would write another Hemingway novel until one night I had a dream about Martha Gellhorn and knew I had to write about her. But she was such a badass. She reported on virtually every major conflict of the 20th century. She went to war in her 20s, reporting on the Spanish Civil War. She crossed the border from France into Spain on foot in the middle of the night with no Spanish and $50 rolled up and tucked into her boot. Like she took no prisoners. She was incredible.
Sounds like a real badass. And two follow-up questions to talking about these incredible women. Was there something that surprised you most about how both love and ambition collide in those lives or other lives you've written about with your characters? And I have one more for you after that.
Yeah. Okay. So just to hit on Martha Gellhorn for a minute, if you think about it, so she was married to Ernest for 5 years. They were both writers. Hadley didn't have a career. She was a pianist and she was a mother and a muse and she was many, many things, but she didn't have a competing career. And Martha was trying to be a novelist. She was trying to be a writer. She wanted it very badly, but Ernest, who was at that moment like the most famous writer in America. He was on the cover of Time magazine. His novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, which he wrote when he was with her, sold more copies than any other novel except Gone with the Wind at that moment. Can you imagine having to hold on to your agency, everything, your sense of self,
right,
confidence, all of that, while being married to this mammoth figure in arts and letters, as well as being a mammoth figure, just personally speaking. And I think she kind of cut her teeth on standing up to him,
Sure. Now, one more for you here. What assumptions about women, historical or modern, did writing these lives kind of quietly dismantle for you, if any?
I guess that we never know anything about anyone's life until we start peeling back the layers. And I do believe that virtually any human life, when looked at deeply enough, with enough empathy and trying to understand them, Hemingway said it's not the writer's job to judge, but to deeply understand, to understand as much as possible who they are and why they do what they do. And I think that if we do that, if we look carefully in that way, every human life has a value, and every human life is a story that deserves to be told and given voice to.
There's a lot of those out there. There's a lot of great stories that have yet to be uncovered or unearthed. And maybe there's something lying in there for your next project. If there's
Well,
not
we
something
can
in the
only
pipeline
hope.
already.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you're fun to talk to. I love how deep and thorough and interesting your questions are. It's not the typical interview. It's
Well, I
fun.
got a couple more for you if you'll hang in with me for the ride here, Paula. There's still
Okay.
more
All
to be
right.
unearthed about Paula McLain. One of them, which is, how do you decide which historical moments or figures demand to be fictionalized? Are there just stories out there? You kind of touched upon the catacombs and your kind of cool discovery of that, but are there things out there that you just think kind of demand or called for to
Hmm.
be fictionalized?
I mean, yes. And I have ideas all the time, or people tell me, it's very rare that I'll do an event where somebody doesn't come to me with a little post-it note or something like, so and so's life, you have to tell that one, or. But to me, that's not how my own process works. I can't start from a cool idea, and I actually can't reverse engineer it. I can't
Sure.
say that's the idea, that's the figure from history that I need to tackle. It doesn't work. I have to be surprised. It has to be like if you watch those old 20 movies in vaudeville or whatever, they always have like that, the crook, the cane that kind of yanks you sideways. It
Yeah.
always has to happen to me that way, accidentally, from something I read, from something I hear. It's more like, yeah, just a tiny electrifying moment of surprise that
And
turns me toward a book.
those must be really cool to have, I'm sure.
They're my favorite.
And after living inside so many women's lives across history, you've really had to, get inside their heads, their lives, and their emotions to the best of your ability. What has changed most in how you understand voice as a writer? Like who gets it, who loses it, and what it costs to claim it?
Oh, wow. That is a good question. Well, certainly history varies according to who tells it. We know that for sure, right? I had a history class in undergrad that really kind of changed my thinking along these lines. He was a social historian. He was so passionate that he broke like 19 pieces of chalk every class period. I don't he like spat, he's like one of those professors. He
I've
was
had one or two of those professors in my
Oh
life.
my God. So we were learning about colonial history, but there was no wars, there were no men, there were no dates, there were no battles, no nothing. It was all diaries of like seamstresses and women in the home and children and their lives from the inside out. And to me, that's, I don't know, more fascinating than the reverse.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you built your career in historical fiction, but you also mentioned earlier you crossed into suspense. Is there something in particular that determines which genre is like the right container for your next project?
Oh, yeah, container's a great word. Yeah, it all is just about the notion, the idea when it comes to me, like my suspense novel is called When the Stars Go Dark. It's set in Mendocino and it's set in the 1990s, and it's about a missing persons detective who is particularly aligned to listen to the voices of those who are in trouble, who are in great trouble. Anyway, that book also came to me through a dog walk. I, often have ideas when I'm walking the dog or like a long road trip, or I mean, we all do, right? You get in the shower and suddenly you start thinking about whatever. But I was on a dog walk and this character came into my mind, this missing person's character and what might happen to her. And it was just like one of those things. Like I first wanted to spit the idea back. It's like, wrong writer, like that's not going to happen. But it was a long walk. It was like a 6-mile walk around these braided lakes in Shaker Heights, Ohio, where I was living at the time. By the time I got done with the 6 miles, I knew the whole story, and I just thought, okay, well, I've, followed stray ideas before. I mean, The Bear's Wife was a stray idea. What business did I have to write historical fiction? But
Here you are.
here I am.
And for our listeners out there, before we wrap up, I am going to ask Paula for some more succinct advice to all aspiring writers. But it sounds like she might be saying, if you're an aspiring writer out there, take your dog on a walk if you aren't doing that already. You should be, but especially a nice
Take
long
your dog
walk.
on a walk. That's where it's all going to happen for you.
That's where the
The
magic for
magic.
Paula McLain happens. So it might for you too. It might
Walk
just
your
spark
dog.
something.
It'll all happen. No, follow your obsessions. That's what I say. I have writers, aspiring writers who say, how do you know when you have a good idea? I'm like, when you can't stop thinking about it.
Sure.
Don't try to chase the marketplace. Don't try to imagine what somebody wants to read. Write what your heart is telling you to write and let the devil take the rest. Like, we're not in control of any of it. Just follow your heart and see what
No,
happens.
you got to listen to yourself first and foremost. I come from a creative writing background. I actually pursued playwriting in college, and I had a lot of ideas sparked from just personal experiences and also just kind of fantastical ideas I had. But
Do you still write?
here and there, yeah, I have some ideas up my sleeve. I write kind of blog and long form for social media for my career, but I have a lot of ideas that I jot down there. In fact, my magnum opus, I'm a big beer guy. As I said, I have a beer segment at the end of each episode here. I would love to write Oktoberfest the musical. I think there's so much cool history that just
That's
lends
fun.
itself to song that it
Yeah,
could be a fun exploration of those characters.
I like it. I like it. That's really fun.
So
Yeah.
back to Skylark and kind of historical fiction more broadly. What do you hope about Skylark invites readers to reconsider about stories that they think they already know?
Yes. Again, you just lift up a rock. You like start peering under floorboards. You're going to find something you don't know, even about the most well-known moments in history. I feel like this book, if anything else, taught me that. I think that what I want or readers to take away with this particular book, though, is how sometimes history calls us, or certain moments in our own lives call us to be braver than we ever imagined we might be.
Yeah.
And also that any life, this is also such a big part of this book, how any life, like Alouette's life in this book, ripples forward hundreds of years to change Christophe's life, and they never meet. That we can change each other. We can leave marks, the decisions we make and the people we love, and all of these things can ripple forward through time and change other people's lives.
Is there a female character you've written who surprised you the most while you were writing her? Ever things that came out of this character that you didn't quite know were there when you started the exploration?
I think that person might be Beryl Markham, who is the character at the center of Circling the Sun. So she was a racehorse trainer, she was an aviator, she was involved in a love triangle with a big game hunter named Dennis Finch Hatton and Isak Dinesen, who wrote Out of Africa. And I have always been obsessed with Out of Africa, that movie. I always wanted to be, having Robert Redford wash my hair on the side of a riverbank while I wore Ralph Lauren.
Understandable.
Understandable. But I don't think I had ever, she's still probably my favorite character out of any of the other characters. Even in this novel, there was just something about how close I got to her. And when I decided I was writing about her life, I actually didn't know that we shared this DNA from our childhood, that we were both abandoned by our mothers. And it really helped me, I don't know, get close to her, get to the bottom of her in a way. I don't think I've ever been so moved or changed by one of my characters. And after I finished the book, I went to Kenya and I wrote a really long essay for Town and Country magazine. And I followed in her footsteps. I stayed the night in the cottage her father built for her when she was 14 years old. And I went up in a vintage open air biplane and in a bomber jacket and a white silk scarf and wept like a baby, just thinking that my tools, like my art form, it's just so random sometimes that I zhuzh up against these lives, these people who actually lived. And it just felt like my life and her life were touching in space and time.
I can only imagine how powerful that is, especially after you spent so much time in her head, but to go out and actually physically embody some of the things that she did in her life and some of these
exactly.
locations.
It's almost metaphysical. Yeah.
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 Now, you're an author, but I'm sure you have time to read. Maybe not, but if you do have time to read, is there one book you read in 2025 that you'd recommend above all? Anything else out there that people should be tuned into?
Yeah, one book I would recommend, and I wish I had more time to read because it's literally my favorite thing, the book that I read this last year that I loved the most is by my friend Lily King. If you don't know her historical novel Euphoria, it's one of my absolute favorites. But this book is called Heart the Lover, and it is devastating. It is absolutely devastating. It's like a tight read. You could read it in an afternoon, but then you're going to start it again. And it's connected to a book she wrote, I think last year or the year before, called Writers and Lovers. Do you know Lily King's work?
I'm not familiar with Lily King. No, I read a lot. Amazing. I'll have to put her on my list.
She's amazing. Heart the Lover.
Heart the Lover. And Paula, finally for you, other than your book tour, which is upcoming, what's next for Paula McLain?
What's next? I recently moved to Madison, Wisconsin from Cleveland, Ohio, where I lived for almost 24 years. For the weather, I've been telling people the day I moved, it was like -5 or something. The other day it was like -31 here. And I keep saying, should I be wearing seal blubber or something, or have sled dogs? What's next for me? Unpacking boxes. My office is a mess. Actually moving into the place where I happen to newly live. And I'm neurotic. Like, I can't even think about writing in my office with my books aren't unpacked,
You need your space, it sounds like.
I need my space. I need my sacred space. Absolutely.
Well, I wish you all the best of luck in getting that set up for yourself and for your upcoming book tour. To our listeners out there, if we haven't encouraged you by just listening to this wonderful conversation to go out and hang out with Paula and everybody else at Little Saint on February 7th, please think about doing so. Paula, thank you so much for appearing on This Must Be the Place. And until next time, take care.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
The interviews are done, which means I think it's time to crack one open. Interviews make me thirsty, and I want you thirsting for knowledge about some great beer, both local and not so local. Each week, I'll introduce you to a beer I find discussion-worthy and explain the nuances of what makes it fantastic in my eyes and why you should give it a try. And just to keep it on point, I'll even try to make sure the beer reflects the vibe or theme of the episode. Welcome to February, friends. As the longest feeling month of the year passes by and dry January goals are set aside, this is a time of year that I usually love to embrace what I call Flagship February when it comes to beer drinking. A chance to either visit or revisit core beers from a favorite brewery's portfolio that you may have never drank before or are coming back to after a while away. For example, you may love a lot of Sierra Nevada Brewing's beers, but when was the last time you sat and had their pale ale? I make it a goal of mine that once a week at least during February, I seek out a brewery's flagship or one of the original beers it was built on to sit, sip, and explore. This week, I'm going to be stoked on a certain beer. And if that clue hasn't helped you guess where I'm going by now, it's to Santa Rosa and Petaluma's Hen House Brewing and their Stoked Hazy Pale Ale. This beer used to be a showcase for rotating hop profiles to see just how different ones work together, but they went back to their roots and love of Citra hops to create this easy-drinking hazy pale. Pouring a beautiful straw yellow, you get a rush of passion fruit and citrusy notes on the aroma. Not super full-bodied and extremely thirst-quenching, this OG from the Hen House portfolio is aimed to cater to beer lovers everywhere. Plus, I love that you can find it around Sonoma County in many different formats, from multi-packs at the brewery to single cans, like how I snagged mine at a local Trader Joe's. When was the last time you were stoked on Stoked Pale? I encourage you to go out and revisit this beer as part of your Flagship February. It's also the start of a month-long beer enjoyment campaign all around Sonoma County called February, if you can pardon the pun, and what I believe is truly the best time of year for beer to be explored here in our home county. More on that in episodes to come. A huge, huge thank you to Paula for appearing on our show this week. Until next time, cheers and happy February from your host. This Must Be the Place is produced by our friends at Pod Locally, an audio platform helping local voices connect to their communities. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or comment on all your favorite podcast apps, and visit the show notes for more information, links, and resources. Look out for our next drop on Sunday. Until then, I'm your host, Alo Galinsky, saying have a great week.